The California sun beat down mercilessly as I stepped out of my car, squinting at the gleaming glass facade of Coastal Dynamics Marketing. This was it, my first day at what could be a career-defining job. I smoothed down my pencil skirt, took a deep breath, and strode towards the entrance, my heels clicking against the pavement with each step. "Rachel Thompson?" A perky receptionist greeted me, her smile blindingly white. "Mr. Callahan is expecting you. 15th floor." The elevator ride felt endless. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was an imposter, that at any moment someone would realize I didn't belong here. But as the door slid open to reveal a bustling office of sleek desks and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Huntington Beach, I steeled myself. I belonged here. I'd earned this. Mr. Callahan, a silver-haired man with a paunch that belied his expensive suit, gave me a perfunctory welcome before pawning me off on HR for orientation. By lunchtime, my head was spinning with new names, faces, and protocols. I was just about to sneak off for a much-needed coffee when a memo appeared in my inbox. "Company mixer tonight. Attendance mandatory." Great. Nothing like being the new girl at a work party. Hours later, I found myself in the building's swanky rooftop bar, nursing a glass of Chardonnay and trying to look busy on my phone. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, but I barely noticed, too focused on not making a fool of myself. "You must be Rachel," a voice like honey startled me from my reverie. I looked up and my breath caught in my throat. She was stunning, tall and willowy, with cascading auburn hair and eyes the color of sea glass. Her emerald dress clung to every curve, and when she smiled, I swear the room got brighter. "I'm Ruby," she continued, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "Ruby Callahan. My husband's been raving about the new marketing whiz he hired." I nearly choked on my wine. This goddess was married to my boss? "It's, nice to meet you." I managed to stammer, hoping my hand wasn't too clammy as I shook hers. Ruby laughed, a musical sound that sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. "Relax, honey, I don't bite." She winked, and I felt my cheeks flush. "Come on, let me introduce you to some people. Can't have our new star hiding in the corner all night." As she guided me through the crowd, her hand on the small of my back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Like the earth had tilted ever so slightly on its axis. Ruby introduced me to a blur of faces, but I barely registered any of them. I was too distracted by the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, the subtle floral scent of her perfume, the warmth of her touch, as she kept finding excuses to lay a hand on my arm. It was probably just the wine, I told myself, or the nerves of a new job. But as the night wore on and Ruby kept finding her way back to my side, I couldn't deny the spark of electricity that seemed to crackle between us. When she hugged me goodbye at the end of the night, lingering just a moment too long, I felt dizzy, and it had nothing to do with the alcohol. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing. What was happening to me? I'd never felt this way about a woman before, and even if I had, Ruby was my boss's wife, off limits in every possible way. As I crawled into bed that night, I told myself to forget it, to focus on the job, on building my career. But as I drifted off to sleep, all I could see were sea glass eyes and a smile that outshone the sun. The weeks following that fateful mixer were a blur of presentations, client meetings, and late nights at the office. I threw myself into work, desperate to prove myself worthy of the position. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, my thoughts kept drifting back to Ruby. I'd catch glimpses of her sometimes, breezing through the office to meet her husband for lunch. Each time, my heart would do a little somersault. She'd always flash me a secret smile, like we shared some private joke, and I'd be left flustered and fumbling with my words. I told myself it was just a crush, a fleeting infatuation born of nerves and newness. But deep down I knew it was more than that. I'd never felt this way about anyone before, man or woman. The realization terrified me. One rainy Tuesday, Mr. Callahan called me into his office. My palms were sweaty as I sat across from him, convinced he'd somehow read my impure thoughts about his wife. "Rachel?" He began, his voice grave. I have an important assignment for you. I braced myself for the worst, but what came next caught me completely off guard. The company is spearheading a new charity initiative, he explained. I want you to take point on the marketing campaign. You'll be working closely with my wife Ruby. She's heading up the fundraising efforts. My mouth went dry. Sir, are you sure I'm the best person for this? I stammered. He waved away my concerns. You've proven yourself more than capable. Besides, Ruby specifically requested you. My heart did a somersault. She'd asked for me? That afternoon, I found myself in a small conference room, alone with Ruby for the first time since the mixer. She was dressed more casually today, in a soft sweater and jeans that somehow made her even more beautiful. Rachel, she said warmly, pulling me into a hug. I'm so glad you're on board with this project. Her scent enveloped me and I had to resist the urge to bury my face in her hair. Of course, I managed. It's a great cause. As we dove into planning, I found myself relaxing. Ruby was smart and passionate about the charity work, and our ideas seemed to flow seamlessly together. Before I knew it, hours had passed, and the sun was setting outside the window. We should probably call it a day, Ruby said, stretching in a way that made my mouth go dry. Same time tomorrow? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As we gathered our things, Ruby's hand brushed against mine, reaching for a folder. A jolt of electricity shot through me, and I jerked back instinctively. Ruby's eyes met mine, concern evident. Are you okay? Fine, I said quickly. Just static shock, I guess. She held my gaze for a long moment, and I felt like she could see right through me. Rachel, she said softly. You know you can talk to me, right? About anything. I swallowed hard. I know. Thanks, Ruby. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to get Ruby out of my head. The way her eyes lit up when she talked about the charity, the musical sound of her laugh, the feeling of her hand brushing mine. I'd never considered myself anything but straight before. But now, faced with these overwhelming feelings, I was forced to question everything I thought I knew about myself. The next few weeks were torture. Ruby and I worked late most nights, poring over marketing plans and donor lists. Each moment in her presence was exquisite agony. I found myself hanging on her every word, cataloging every casual touch, reading into every lingering glance. One night, as we waited for the elevator after a particularly grueling session, Ruby turned to me with a mischievous glint in her eye. You know, she said, her voice low. All this hard work deserves a reward. What do you say we blow off steam this weekend? Girls' night out. My heart raced at the thought of spending time with Ruby outside of work. It was a terrible idea, dangerous, and yet... Sure, I heard myself say. That sounds great. Ruby's smile was dazzling. Perfect. I know just the place. As I drove home that night, my mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Excitement, guilt, fear, longing. I knew I was playing with fire. But as I recalled the way Ruby's eyes had sparkled when I agreed to go out, I realized I didn't care if I got burned. For the first time in my life, I was falling hard, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The weekend arrived with a mix of anticipation and dread churning in my stomach. I must have changed outfits a dozen times before settling on a slinky black dress that hugged my curves in all the right places. As I applied a final swipe of lipstick, I told myself this was just a friendly night out, nothing more. Ruby picked me up in a sleek convertible, looking utterly breathtaking in a red dress that left little to the imagination. Ready to paint the town gorgeous? She asked with a wink that made my knees weak. We ended up at a trendy rooftop bar with panoramic views of the coastline. As we sipped colorful cocktails and chatted about everything and nothing, I found myself relaxing. Ruby had a way of putting me at ease, making me feel like I was the only person in the world when she looked at me. So, Ruby said, leaning in conspiratorially, any lucky man in your life? I nearly choked on my drink. No, I managed. Not at the moment, focusing on work and all that. Ruby's eyes sparkled with something I couldn't quite read. Their loss, she said softly. Her hand found mine on the table, and I felt that familiar jolt of electricity. You're quite a catch, Rachel. Before I could formulate a response, Ruby was pulling me to my feet. Come on, she said. Let's dance. The rest of the night passed in a blur of pulsing music, flowing drinks, and Ruby's body pressed against mine as we danced. Every time her hands found my waist or her breath tickled my ear, I felt myself falling deeper under her spell. As the night wound down, Ruby suggested we head back to her place for a nightcap. I knew I should say no, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself following her into her penthouse apartment, marveling at the luxurious decor and the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the twinkling city lights. Ruby poured us each a glass of wine and led me out onto the balcony. The cool night air was a welcome relief after the heat of the club. We stood in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our wine and gazing out at the view. I'm really glad you came out tonight, Ruby said softly, turning to face me. Her eyes seemed to glow in the moonlight, and I found myself mesmerized. Me too, I whispered. And then, before I could talk myself out of it, I leaned in and kissed her. For a heart-stopping moment, Ruby froze, and I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. But then her lips softened against mine, and she was kissing me back with a hunger that took my breath away. It was everything I'd imagined, and more. Her lips were soft, tasting of wine and lipstick, and when her tongue teased at the seam of my mouth, I opened for her eagerly. My hands found her waist, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened. We broke apart, both breathing heavily. Ruby's eyes were wide, her lipstick smudged. Rachel, she breathed. I've wanted to do that for so long. The confession sent a thrill through me. Me too, I admitted. Ruby's hand cupped my cheek, her thumb tracing my lower lip. But we can't, she said softly, regret evident in her voice. My husband? Reality came crashing back and I stepped away, feeling as though I'd been doused with cold water. God, I'm so sorry, I said, mortified. I don't know what came over me. Ruby caught my hand as I turned to flee. Hey, she said gently. Don't apologize, I wanted it too. It's just complicated. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The magic of the moment had shattered, leaving only guilt and confusion in its wake. I should go, I said, avoiding her eyes. Ruby didn't try to stop me this time. As I gathered my things and called a cab, she hovered nearby, looking as lost as I felt. At the door she caught my arm. Rachel, she said softly, we're okay, right? This doesn't have to change anything. I forced a smile. Of course, I lied. It was just a kiss, no big deal. But as I rode home in the cab, tears stinging my eyes, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. The next few days at work were excruciating. Ruby and I danced around each other, our easy camaraderie replaced by stilted small talk and awkward silences. Every time I saw her with her husband, a fresh wave of guilt washed over me. I told myself it was for the best. That the kiss had been a mistake, a moment of weakness fueled by alcohol and loneliness. But in the quiet moments, when I let myself be truly honest, I knew the truth. I was falling in love with Ruby Callahan, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Weeks passed, and the tension between Ruby and me became almost unbearable. We continued to work on the charity project, but our interactions were strained, filled with loaded glances and words left unsaid. I threw myself into my work, staying late at the office and taking on extra projects in an attempt to distract myself from the ache in my chest. It was during one of these late nights that Ruby found me, hunched over my desk, drowning in spreadsheets. She closed the door behind her, and the soft click seemed to echo in the empty office. Rachel, she said softly. We need to talk. I looked up, my heart racing. Ruby looked tired, her usual polished appearance slightly disheveled. She perched on the edge of my desk, closer than she'd been since that night on her balcony. I can't do this anymore, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, pretending that nothing's changed between us. I swallowed hard. Ruby, She held up a hand, cutting me off. Let me finish. I've been doing a lot of thinking these past few weeks. About my life, my marriage, and you. My breath caught in my throat as Ruby's eyes met mine, filled with an intensity that made my skin tingle. The truth is, she continued, I'm not happy. I haven't been for a long time. My marriage to Robert, it's more of a business arrangement than anything else. We look good on paper, make a great power couple, but there's no love there, no passion. She reached out, her fingers brushing against mine. Not like what I feel when I'm with you. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. What are you saying? I managed to ask. Ruby's other hand came up to cut my cheek. I'm saying that kiss wasn't a mistake. At least, not for me. I've never felt this way about anyone before, Rachel, man or woman. And then she was kissing me, and all thoughts fled from my mind. This kiss was different from our first, slower, deeper, filled with a desperate longing that made my toes curl. I tangled my fingers in her hair, pulling her closer as years of repressed desire came flooding to the surface. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing heavily. What about your husband? I asked, the last vestiges of guilt warring with the overwhelming desire coursing through me. Ruby's eyes were dark with want. Robert's out of town on business. He won't be back for days. It was all the invitation I needed. We barely made it to our car, hands roaming, and lips crashing together at every red light. The ride to her penthouse was a blur of heated touches and half-whispered confessions. As soon as we were through the door, Ruby was pressing me against it, her body flush against mine as she kissed a trail down my neck. I gasped as she found a particularly sensitive spot, my hands fumbling with the zipper of her dress. We left a trail of clothes from the entryway to the bedroom, falling onto the plush king-sized bed in a tangle of limbs. Ruby's skin was soft under my hands, her curves fitting perfectly against me as if we were made for each other. What followed was a night of passionate exploration, of reverent touches and breathless moans. Ruby's fingers and tongue coaxed pleasure from me that I'd never experienced before, and I delighted in discovering all the ways to make her come undone beneath me. As we lay tangled together in the afterglow, Ruby's head resting on my chest, I felt a sense of contentment I'd never known before. But there was also a nagging fear in the pit of my stomach. What happens now? I asked softly, running my fingers through Ruby's tousled hair. She propped herself up on an elbow, her eyes meeting mine. I don't know, she admitted, but I do know I don't want to give this up. Give you up? What about your husband, your marriage? Ruby sighed. It's been over for a long time. We've just been going through the motions. It's made me realize I can't keep living a lie. She leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to my lips. I want to be with you, Rachel. Really be with you. No more sneaking around, no more pretending. I'll tell Robert when he gets back. Ask for a divorce. My heart soared at her words, even as anxiety gnawed at me. Are you sure? This could change everything. Your life, your social standing. Ruby silenced me with another kiss. You're worth it, she said simply. We spent the next few days in a bubble of bliss, barely leaving the penthouse except for necessities. We made love in every room, talked for hours about our hopes and dreams, and allowed ourselves to imagine a future together. But reality had a way of intruding. As Robert's return drew nearer, the weight of our situation began to press down on us. We both knew that once Ruby told him the truth, there would be no going back. The night before Robert was due home, we lay in bed, Ruby tracing patterns on my skin. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. I pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I know, but we'll face it together. Whatever happens. As I drifted off to sleep, Ruby nestled safely in my arms. I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, we could have our happily ever after. Little did I know, our world was about to come crashing down around us. The morning Robert was due back. Ruby and I reluctantly disentangled ourselves from each other. We'd agreed it would be best if I wasn't there when she broke the news to him. With a lingering kiss and whispered promises, I left her penthouse, my heart both light with love and heavy with apprehension. At work, I found it nearly impossible to concentrate. Every ping of my phone had me jumping, expecting news from Ruby. But as the hours ticked by with no word, anxiety began to gnaw at my insides. It was late afternoon when my office phone rang, startling me out of my worried reverie. "Rachel," Mr. Callahan's voice was clipped. "My office, now." My stomach dropped as I made my way to his corner office, my mind racing through possible scenarios. Had Ruby told him? Was I about to be fired? I wasn't prepared for the scene that greeted me. Robert Callahan sat behind his desk, his face a mask of cold fury. Ruby stood to the side, her eyes red-rimmed and pleading, and on the desk between them lay a stack of photographs. My blood ran cold as I recognized the images. Ruby and me, tangled together in various states of undress. Intimate moments I thought had been ours alone, now exposed for all to see. "Care to explain this?" Robert's voice was dangerously quiet as he gestured to the photos. I opened my mouth but no words came out. Ruby stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Robert, please. This isn't Rachel's fault. Silence," he roared, slamming his fist on the desk. "I trusted you," he said, turning his glare on me. "Brought you into my company, my home. And this is how you repay me? By seducing my wife?" "It wasn't like that," I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. We fell in love." Robert's laugh was bitter. "Love? You call this filth love?" He swept the photos off his desk, sending them scattering across the floor. "You're fired. Effective immediately. Clear out your desk and be gone within the hour." I stood there, shell-shocked, as security was called to escort me out. Ruby tried to intervene, but Robert silenced her with a look that made her shrink back. As I was led away, I caught one last glimpse of her tear-stained face before the elevator doors closed between us. In a daze, I packed up my personal belongings, ignoring the curious and pitying looks from my now former coworkers. Rumors spread like wildfire in an office, and I had no doubt that by tomorrow, everyone would know the sordid details of my affair with the boss's wife. I barely remember the drive home, my mind a whirlwind of fear and regret. How had this happened? Who could have taken those photos? And what would happen to Ruby now? As if summoned by my thoughts, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Storage Unit 247, Sunset Self-Storage. Code 1305. Go now. R." My hands shook as I changed course, heading for the storage facility. I found the unit easily enough, punching in the code with trepidation. The door rolled up to reveal Ruby, pacing nervously in the small space. "Ruby." I rushed to her, pulling her into my arms. "Are you okay? What happened?" She clung to me, her body shaking with silent sobs. "It was awful," she whispered. "After you left, I tried to talk to Robert to explain. But then he got a package. Those photos. He went ballistic." I stroked her hair, murmuring soothing words even as my own heart raced. "Who took them? How did they even?" Ruby shook her head. "I don't know. Robert wouldn't say. He just kept yelling about how I'd humiliated him, ruined everything." She pulled back, her eyes meeting mine. "Rachel, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault." "Hey, no," I said firmly, cupping her face in my hands. "We're in this together, remember? Whatever happens, we'll face it as a team." A ghost of a smile crossed her lips. "You still want to be with me, even after all this?" I answered her with a kiss, pouring all my love and reassurance into it. When we parted, both slightly breathless, I rested my forehead against hers. "Always," I whispered. We spent the next few hours huddled together in that storage unit, trying to piece together a plan. Ruby had managed to grab some cash and valuables before fleeing the penthouse, but we knew it wouldn't last long. We'd both lost our jobs, and once word got out about the affair, finding new employment in this town would be nearly impossible. We could leave, Ruby suggested hesitantly. Start fresh somewhere new, where no one knows us. The idea was tempting. A clean slate, a chance to build a life together without the shadows of our past hanging over us. But could we really just run away from everything? As night fell, we reluctantly agreed it was time to leave our hiding spot. Ruby was going to stay with a friend for the night, someone she trusted to keep her whereabouts secret from Robert. We made plans to meet again tomorrow, to figure out our next move. Just before we parted, Ruby pulled me close, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I love you, she said softly. No matter what happens, please remember that. I kissed her, trying to convey all the emotions swirling inside me. I love you too, I whispered against her lips. We'll get through this, I promise. As I watched her drive away, a strange mix of fear and hope battled in my chest. Our world had been turned upside down in the span of a day, all our carefully laid plans shattered. But as I climbed into my own car, I found myself filled with a fierce determination. We'd fight for our love, no matter the cost. And somehow, some way, we'd find our way to happily ever after. The next few weeks passed in a blur of chaos and uncertainty. Ruby and I met in secret, constantly looking over our shoulders, paranoid that Robert or one of his cronies might be following us. We'd underestimated just how much influence he wielded in Huntington Beach. My phone rang incessantly with calls from unknown numbers, reporters hungry for the juicy details of the scandal, old coworkers torn between curiosity and judgment, even a few headhunters offering jobs in exchange for my story. I ignored them all, focusing solely on Ruby and her uncertain future. Ruby, for her part, was a wreck. The stress of the situation had taken its toll, leaving dark circles under her eyes and a permanent furrow in her brow. She'd filed for divorce, but Robert was fighting her every step of the way, threatening to drag her name through the mud if she didn't agree to his terms. He wants everything, she confided one night, curled up against me in the cheap motel room we'd been using for our clandestine meetings. The house, the cars, even my grandmother's jewelry. Says if I don't agree, he'll make sure everyone knows what a depraved lesbian I am. I held her close, rage bubbling in my chest at the thought of Robert's cruelty. We'll fight him, I promised, even as doubt gnawed at me. He can't bully you into submission. But as the days wore on, it became clear that Robert's reach extended further than we'd imagined. Ruby's credit cards were suddenly declined. Her bank accounts were frozen. Even her friend, the one who'd given her shelter that first night, started making excuses for why Ruby couldn't stay any longer. He's trying to smoke me out, Ruby said, her voice hollow. Make me so desperate I'll crawl back to him, beg forgiveness. I took her hand, squeezing it gently. That's not going to happen. We'll figure something out. But the truth was, I was running out of ideas. My own savings were dwindling rapidly, and with my reputation in tatters, finding a new job seemed impossible. We talked about leaving town, starting fresh somewhere new, but the logistics of it all seemed overwhelming. It was during one of our late-night strategy sessions that Ruby's phone buzzed with a text. She glanced at it, her face paling. It's Robert, she whispered. He wants to meet. Says he's willing to negotiate. Every instinct in me screamed that it was a trap, but what choice did we have? We were running out of options, and fast. The next day, we found ourselves in a private room at an upscale restaurant, Robert's choice. He was already there when we arrived, looking impeccable in a tailored suit, a smug smile playing at his lips. Ladies, he greeted us, his tone dripping with condescension. So glad you could join me. Ruby squeezed my hand under the table as we sat down. I could feel her trembling slightly. What do you want, Robert? I asked, cutting straight to the chase. He chuckled, taking a sip of his whiskey. Straight to business, I see. Very well. He leveled his gaze at Ruby. I'm willing to give you the divorce, even let you keep some of your precious baubles. All I ask in return is your silence. Ruby's brow furrowed. My silence? Robert's smile turned predatory. You sign an NDA. Agree never to speak about our marriage, our divorce, or your dalliance with MMM's Thompson here. You both disappear from Huntington Beach, never to darken my doorstep again. In return, I won't press charges for corporate espionage. Corporate espionage? I sputtered. That's ridiculous. We never. Oh, but you did, Robert interrupted smoothly. You see, I have evidence that you, Rachel, accessed confidential client information and passed it along to my wife, who then used it to undermine several key business deals. My mouth went dry as the implication sank in. It was a lie, of course, but would anyone believe us over Robert Callahan, pillars of the community? You can't do this, Ruby whispered, her voice shaking. Robert's eyes glittered coldly. I think you'll find I can do whatever I want. You have 24 hours to decide. Sign the papers or I'll see you both in court, and trust me, you won't like the outcome. With that, he stood, straightening his jacket. Oh, and one more thing, he added, almost as an afterthought. I know about your little plan to run away together. I wouldn't recommend it. You'd be surprised how many friends I have in unexpected places. As he walked away, leaving us shell-shocked in his wake, I felt a chill run down my spine. We were well and truly trapped. The drive back to our motel was silent, both of us lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we were safely behind closed doors that Ruby broke down, collapsing into my arms with heaving sobs. What are we going to do? She cried, her tears soaking through my shirt. I held her close, my mind racing. Robert's ultimatum left us with impossible choices. Sign away our right to ever speak about what had happened, essentially erasing our love story from existence. Fight him in court, knowing he had the resources to bury us in legal fees and false accusations. Or run, always looking over our shoulders, wondering when his friends might catch up to us. As the night wore on, Ruby's sobs quieted, replaced by the slow, steady breathing of exhausted sleep. I lay awake, staring at the water-stained ceiling, trying to find a way out of this mess. Just before dawn, as the first rays of sunlight began to peek through the dingy curtains, an idea began to form. It was risky, potentially dangerous, and would require perfect timing. But if it worked... I gently shook Ruby awake, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. I think I have a plan, I whispered. As I outlined my idea, I saw a spark of hope ignite in Ruby's eyes for the first time in weeks. It was a long shot, but it was all we had. Are you sure about this? She asked, her hand finding mine in the dim light. I squeezed her fingers, bringing them to my lips for a gentle kiss. No, I admitted, but I'm sure about us, and I'm willing to risk everything if it means a chance at a future together. Ruby nodded, a determined set to her jaw. Okay, she said softly. Let's do it. As we began to put our plan into motion, I sent up a silent prayer to whatever higher power might be listening. We'd come too far, fought too hard, to give up now. One way or another, this would end today. The next 24 hours were a whirlwind of activity. Our plan was audacious, bordering on insane, but it was our only shot at freedom. We reached out to every contact we had, calling in favors and making promises we weren't sure we could keep. As the deadline approached, we found ourselves back in Robert's office, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Ruby squeezed my hand under the table, a gesture of solidarity and strength. Robert smirked as he slid the NDA across the desk. I knew you'd see reason, he said smugly. Sign here, and this whole nasty business will be behind us. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what came next. Actually, Robert, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, we have a counter-proposal. His eyebrows shot up. Oh? And what might that be? That's when we laid it all out. The evidence we'd gathered of Robert's own indiscretions, the offshore accounts, the insider trading, the string of mistresses he'd paid off over the years. It had taken every connection we had, every ounce of cunning and desperation, but we'd done it. You see, Ruby said, her voice cold, we're not the only ones with secrets. Robert's face went from smug to thunderous in an instant. "You're bluffing," he snarled. I pulled out my phone, queuing up an email. "Are we? Because I'm about to send this to every major news outlet and the SEC. Unless—" "Unless what?" Robert growled. "Unless you agree to our terms," Ruby finished. "A fair divorce settlement, no NDA, and you leave us alone, for good." The next few moments were tense, Robert's eyes darting between us and the phone in my hand. I could almost see the wheels turning in his head, weighing his options. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "Fine," he spat. "You win. I'll have my lawyer draw up the papers." As we left his office, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. We'd done it. We were free. The following weeks were a blur of legal meetings and paperwork, but true to his word, Robert kept his distance. The divorce was finalized without fanfare, and Ruby walked away with a settlement that would ensure our financial stability for years to come. We decided to leave Huntington Beach. Too many painful memories lingering in its sun-soaked streets. We found a charming little town up the coast, close enough to the ocean to hear the waves at night, but far enough from our past to start fresh. It was there, in our cozy beachfront home, that Ruby and I finally allowed ourselves to breathe, to plan, to dream. "I still can't believe we did it," Ruby mused one evening, as we sat on our porch watching the sunset. "There were moments," I thought. I silenced her with a kiss. "But we did," I reminded her. "Together." She smiled, that radiant smile that had captured my heart from the beginning. "Together," she echoed. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us here. The stolen glances, the forbidden kisses, the heart-wrenching decisions and nail-biting confrontations. It had been a roller coaster of emotions, but I wouldn't change a single moment. Because every trial, every tear had led us to this. To us. I reached into my pocket, my fingers closing around the small velvet box I'd been carrying for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. As Ruby turned to me, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun, I knew that moment had arrived. "Ruby," I began, my voice thick with emotion. "These past months have been the most challenging, terrifying, and ultimately beautiful of my life. You've shown me what true love really means, the kind of love that's worth fighting for, worth risking everything for." Her eyes widened as I slid off the porch swing, going down on one knee before her. "I don't want to waste another moment wondering what the future holds. I want to face it with you, by my side for the rest of our lives." Tears glistened in Ruby's eyes as I opened the box, revealing the delicate diamond ring nestled inside. "Ruby Callahan, will you marry me?" For a heart-stopping moment, Ruby was silent, her hand covering her mouth in shock. Then, with a joyous laugh, she threw her arms around me. "Yes," she cried. "1,000 times yes." As I slipped the ring onto her finger, our lips met in a kiss that held all the promise of our future together. The road hadn't been easy, but we'd weathered the storm, we'd faced down threats, overcome obstacles, and emerged stronger for it. In that moment, with Ruby in my arms and the endless horizon before us, I knew that this was just the beginning of our greatest adventure yet. Whatever challenges life might throw our way, we'd face them as we had everything else, together. As the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Ruby and I held each other close, basking in the glow of our love and the promise of tomorrow. We'd fought for this happiness, this chance at a life together. And now, finally, we had our happily ever after. The end was just the beginning. And oh, what a beautiful beginning it was.